Genetic drift is another microevolutionary force that can lead to changes in a population's gene pool. However, unlike natural selection, the changes in the gene pool are totally random. They have nothing to do with the fitness of a particular genotype. So again, the big thing here is that it's not fitness related. There are changes in the gene pool due to random chance. And so genetic drift is always happening. So right now, human populations, bird populations, crab populations, all populations are experiencing genetic drift. However, it is so slow under normal circumstances. And that normal circumstances is when the population is large. So as long as you have a large population, genetic drift is very, very slow. However, it is happening. And what it is slowly causing is either loss or fixation of an allele. So say you have a population that has the big A allele and the little a allele. Over time, and again, this can take a really long time if a population is large, one of these alleles, doesn't matter which one, it's totally random. Both alleles are fit, equally fit. Okay, so I just want to reiterate that. They're equally fit, yet by random chance, A will either go to 0% or 100%. So that's the big A. 0 would be a total loss of the big A allele. 100% would be fixation of the big A allele. And then the same thing would be happening to little a. So if big A goes to 0%, then the little a allele would go to 100%. And if the big A went to 100%, then the little a would go to 0%. So one of the alleles goes to fixation and the other allele goes to loss. And again, this is totally random because they are equally fit. Now, again, this is always happening in populations, but when populations are very large, like populations that are healthy normally are, then the population's experiencing this at a very, very slow rate. Slow that we can virtually not see it. We can ignore it, right, or assume it's not happening. But certain things can happen that cause a population to be small suddenly. So again, this is going to be when a small population is suddenly created from what used to be a large population. And if that small population is created after being a large population, then genetic drift is going to speed up. Okay, so again, genetic drift is always happening, but it will occur faster in scenarios where you have a small population that's suddenly created. And there's two specific ways that this can happen that we'll talk about, called the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. But first, you just want to take a closer look at this idea that genetic drift happens faster in smaller populations. So imagine a population of mice where we have the big B allele, which leads to the dark-colored mice, and the little b allele, which is recessive and leads to white mice. The mice are kind of hard to see on the screen here, but there's some white mice here. Okay, so what we're saying with genetic drift is that in a population where you're 50-50 of the two alleles, so the y-axis here is the big B allele, so 0.5 frequency of big B allele suggests that there's also 0.5 of the little b allele. We're just not graphing it. But so what we're seeing is that if you have a large population, in this case it's a population of 1,000, so this number here is the population size. Over 50 generations, there's very little change in the frequency of the of the big B allele. It stays around 0.5. Okay, so that's when the population is big. But if the population is much smaller, so here the population is only 10. Due to genetic drift, the two possibilities depicted here are equally likely. Either the big B allele will head towards fixation, so we see these dramatic ups and downs, but over 50 generations, we head towards 1.0, which remember is equal to 100%. So that would be the big B allele becoming fixed. Or, and this is equally possible because it's random, neither allele is more fit. Okay, so just reminding you, because we've talked about scenarios where there is a fitness advantage, that in this particular environment, there is no fitness advantage. Okay, so equal fitness. So it's equally likely that in a small population over a small number of generations, that big B allele will go to loss, to 0% of the population. And again, this process is sped up when population size is small. It's very, 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 very slow, essentially not happening if the population size is large. And fixation or loss of the allele is equally likely if the population is small because there's no fitness advantage. This is not natural selection. So let's take a look at the ways that we can get a small population suddenly out in nature. So the first of these is called the bottleneck effect. And the bottleneck effect is caused usually by some type of natural disaster. So that's kind of the classic example. It can be an earthquake, it can be a flood. It can also be a disease that randomly affects individuals. And remember, the key word here is randomly. So there's no advantage to their genetics. So there's no individuals that are more resistant to the disease or anything like that. The disease has to affect individuals equally, okay? So that's why I say only some diseases would fit under this. So earthquake, flood, or some disease that randomly kills individuals. It goes through, so in this example, it's a pond, and we have yellow frogs, green frogs, and brown frogs. And the bottleneck event is a drought. And so we see a change where the pond is drying up and several of the frogs die. And that death is random. So the yellow frogs don't live longer than the green frogs in drought. There's no advantage. But what happens is by random chance, the yellow and brown frogs happen to survive more. So some phenotypes randomly survive more. So the best kind of analogy I can give you is if you imagine, if you flipped a coin 10 times, right? And by chance you got 7 heads and only 3 tails. Okay. Now, again, you know that you should get 5 and 5 of heads and tails, but by random chance, you only got 7 heads and 3 tails. That's what's happening with the drought. Instead of getting the exact distribution of frogs that we had at the start point, by random chance, we got more yellows and browns. Just like by random chance, I got more heads than tails when I flipped the coin. Okay? It's not due to survival differences. No phenotype is more fit than the other. Now, after the drought, right, we get over time these survivors reproducing. And because more of the yellow and brown ones survived, this new population has a different allele frequency than this population. So this is the original allele frequency. And now afterwards, we have a different allele frequency. Again, due to random chance, because the drought randomly killed individuals. And so the biggest thing that usually happens, not only is there a different allele frequency, but there's usually less variation. So and this is kind of why it's called a bottleneck as well, as you're kind of squeezing the population through the neck of a bottle, and only some individuals are coming through, and the individuals that come through usually are bringing less traits with them than the original bottle. And so in this example, we can see that the original population had green, but the surviving population does not have the green allele. So there's less variation in this new population. And this has happened throughout history through various natural disasters and different events that can happen to organisms in nature. This in modern times is happening a lot to endangered species. So endangered species are experiencing a bottleneck, usually not due to natural causes like natural disasters, but due to human things. So like overhunting or loss of habitat can lead their population to shrink dramatically in a short period of time. And that shrinkage can be totally random, again, not related to their fitness, but just related to, again, losing habitat, for example. And so just like we see with this bottleneck, what we get is a loss of variation in the surviving members. And this is really negative. It can make it even harder for the endangered species to recover because, as we've talked about, genetic variation is the raw material of evolution. It's what makes populations healthy and able to adapt over time to a changing world. And without that genetic variation, the endangered species faces additional challenges than they were already facing. The founder effect, again, is a time when we get a small population suddenly. And again, this will initiate faster genetic drift, so we get those changes in allele frequencies suddenly. It's really similar to a bottleneck, but the cause of the shrinking population is different. So you have an original population that is large, and some of the organisms split off of that large population and become founders, right? So they found a new population in a new area. And that population is inherently smaller than the original larger population because only a small number of them left the original population. And so the kind of classic geography that promotes this is a mainland with a large original population and islands. So again, this is touching back on the Darwin's finches example, where we had a large amount of beak variety over on the original mainland population, and we get less beak variation on the different islands. And so what happens is, again, you have a large population with a lot of diversity, many different alleles, but by chance, only some of the alleles get here. And so at that point, you can have natural selection occur. So I don't want to confuse you because we talked about the finches as an example of natural selection as well. But some of the traits that the island birds get are just getting different through genetic drift. And so you can see variation occur between the original population and the islands just from genetic drift because some birds that came over had less of that color variation, for example. So let me give you an example, actually, because this is getting a little confusing. So remember, we had our birds, and they had different sized beaks, but they also had different colors. So we might have a black bird. We might have a brown bird. Now, we talked a lot about how the beak size could matter for natural selection on the islands. But if our original population also varies in color, like black, brown, let me go ahead and throw in a white as well. So let's say we have, in addition to different beak sizes, different colors of birds. By random chance, you might have an island that only gets black and brown founding birds. And this island might only get brown and white founding birds. And this one might only get white birds. And so you end up with islands having different gene pools than the original population with less variation than the original population, just based on whichever birds were the first birds to get there from the mainland. And so, again, this leads to dramatic changes in allele frequency very rapidly because of this creation of new small populations. And then those small founding populations will go on to pass on their limited genetic variation. So again, if this island only has black and brown, then they will only be able to pass on the black and brown color. They won't have any white offspring. This can happen in humans too. So probably one of the most well-known examples is the Amish. In the United States, the Amish are all descended from a really small group that came here in the 1800s or 1700s maybe. And all modern-day Amish are descendants of that small founding population. And so you see certain genetic traits enhanced in that population. There's more of those alleles. And this is of particular interest when it comes to disease. So for certain diseases, they have certain diseases at a higher rate because by random chance, a couple of those founding members of the Amish population in the United States were carrying that disease allele at a higher percentage than you see in the general population. And so it can have significant consequences. So to sort of round out genetic drift connects to a whole broader idea, the neutral theory of evolution. So Darwin really focused on the idea of natural selection and fitness as the drivers of evolution. But today we kind of understand that non-Darwinian evolution is just as powerful, if not more powerful, than Darwinian evolution. So again, non-Darwinian means not driven by fitness and natural selection. So our modern understanding is that we have a lot of variation in the population that is not significant for fitness. Rather, it just occurs due to genetic drift. And so probably the best example to give you is to think about human populations. So we have darker skin in some populations, darker hair, specific eyebrow shapes or eyelid shapes or chin shapes. Like different populations have different appearances that have become common in their population, and that has occurred through genetic drift, right? So a lot of the variation between different groups of people is due to genetic drift. That variation has no functional use. There's no fitness advantage to much of the variation between human populations. It's just drifted that way as humans separated from each other and migrated across the globe. And so that that neutral variation, again, didn't mean anything. It doesn't affect their fitness at all, and yet it's still drifted to be at a higher rate in one population versus another population. And so we know now that most of the traits, or a lot of the traits that we see, are not necessarily related to fitness. Okay, so I just want to reiterate these. Many trait variations are caused by drift, not by natural selection. So this is really, I just want to reiterate this because sometimes this can be a barrier to understanding evolution. If we think that every trait that an organism has to have a special fitness advantage or purpose, you would get really frustrated because you'd be like, what could possibly be the advantage of this shaped nose? Well, there is no advantage to this shaped nose. It happens to run in my ethnic group, right? I'm Middle Eastern and I have a Middle Eastern nose, but there's no fitness advantage to it. That nose shape drifted to that nose shape in Middle Eastern populations. So it's important to realize that when we're talking about traits and evolution, not all of them have a specific special purpose fit to their environment. They just ended up that way. The sort of second piece of this is not only do specific phenotypes or physical traits not necessarily provide an advantage, but in many cases we have neutral mutations that do not affect the phenotype at all. And so these are sometimes also called silent mutations. So much of the difference between individuals and between groups of organisms is silent mutations. These are changes in the DNA. They don't affect the phenotype at all, and yet they will also evolve over time. And so you find, again, kind of come back to the human example, certain types of mutations that are associated with Middle Eastern populations versus African populations. Northern Europeans have specific silent mutations associated with their population. Southern Europeans have silent mutations associated with their population. So beyond even just traits that don't provide advantages, we can also track the evolution of silent mutations that have no effect on phenotype. And so all of these things are evolving. Even though they don't have fitness advantages or they don't change our traits, they're still experiencing evolution. They're experiencing non-Darwinian evolution.